Hello and welcome to another episode of India and Global Left. Today we have with us Professor Aviva Chomsky. Professor Chomsky is an American professor, historian, author, and activist. Professor Chomsky, welcome to India and Global Left.
Thanks for having me back on the show, or the podcast, I should say.
Absolutely. Yes, so I wrote to you thinking about your book on Cuba, and you said that you have been busy and involved with the Palestinian resistance movement, Palestinian movement. And I mean, it didn't surprise me given the background you grew up in, but I wasn't aware of your involvement with the Palestinian movement. So if you can give us a little bit about how did you get involved with the cause?
Sure. So I got involved, I wouldn't say exactly with the Palestinian resistance movement, but with the Palestinian solidarity movement more. In 1982 with the Israeli invasion of Lebanon. And I was a college student at the time. And most of my involvement or focus had been on Latin America. I had spent quite a bit of time there, and with Latin American immigrant communities, I spoke Spanish fluently. And so that was sort of my focus. But with the Israeli invasion of Lebanon, I was just glued to the television set in rage and horror day after day and feeling so helpless. That was back in the days before social media. So we got our news from TV. Talking to a friend, learned that there was a new organization that had been formed. I was at Berkeley. So there was a new organization that was in the process of forming on campus called CAFIA, the Committee for Academic Freedom in the Israeli Occupied Territories. And we boldly decided to go to a meeting. You know, we contacted somebody we knew in the organization and decided to go to the meeting. And then I was just hooked from that moment on. And I became a really deeply involved with the organization, CAFIAT. And at that very first meeting, I think we were talking about different activities that or projects that we could get involved in. And I can't remember exactly how it happened, but another student and I signed up to start a newsletter. So we were like the founders of the CAFIAT newsletter, and that threw me into doing a lot of research and a lot of writing, and also learning the primitive technology of desktop publishing as it was back in the early 1980s, and also just being in touch with a lot of people around the world who were reporting on what was going on in Lebanon and Israel and the occupied territories. And then another project that I was really central to in CAFIAT was starting a course on Palestine. Through Berkeley had this system through the Peace and Conflict Studies department where students could run a course that others could actually take for credit. So we applied for a student-run course on Palestine, and this was the first course on Palestine in the United States, as far as I know, specifically on Palestine. And the way we organized the course was by inviting guest speakers. And because it was such an unusual course to have, everybody wanted to come. So we had, Edward Said came and spoke in the class. My dad, Noam Chomsky, came and spoke in the class. And we did it for, I can't remember how many years, but every year it was like a big event on campus, the Palestine class. So we would have a guest speaker, and then a group of us students would run discussion sections. And, that process also really obviously helped with my education on the issue and my outrage. And a group of us, I still am a runner. But, in the Central America Solidarity Movement, there were all these runs, run for medical aid to El Salvador, run for solidarity with the Sandinistas, fundraising runs. And so we decided to organize a run for Palestinian universities. And we worked with CAFIAT and another organization, Najda, Women Concerned About the Middle East. I don't know if Najda still exists. Caveat doesn't exist as an organization anymore, although of course Palestinian Solidarity at Berkeley does. And the Palestine course still exists in a new iteration at Berkeley through Peace and Conflict Studies. So for 3 years running, we did the run and we raised money for scholarships for students at Birzeit and Al-Najah universities on the West Bank. And that was another kind of organizing activity, because we advertised it and people had to get sponsors to run. So we raised thousands of dollars and also got a lot of publicity with the runs. And, a big focus of Caveat as an organization was, it's really funny to think 1982 was so long ago, but the occupation wasn't that old. The occupation of the West Bank and Gaza in 1982. Like now it's been going on forever, right? But in 1982, it was only 20 some years old. Even, no, less than 20 years old, right? 67 to 82. And so the idea that the occupation could be ended seemed more realistic at that point. And, but as a university organization, we were specifically focusing on the Israeli incursions into Palestinian universities and denial of the freedom of students to study there. And then the last big project that I was involved in before leaving Berkeley really was Measure E, which was, we decided to run a citywide initiative to ask the Berkeley City Council to send a letter to Congress demanding that U.S. aid to Israel be reduced by the amount that Israel was spending on illegal settlements and illegal activities in the West Bank. We were thinking more about the West Bank than Gaza. I can't tell you exactly why, but that's where our focus was at the time. Certainly the West Bank was where the biggest settlement activity was going on. So that was another huge campaign that lasted for like a year. And our goal, obviously a letter from the Berkeley City Council would have been completely symbolic and would not have really had an effect on US policy. Our goal was mostly educational, to have a mechanism to be out in the street talking to people about Israel's illegal settlements. So, stop Israel's illegal settlements was kind of our slogan. And we collected signatures to get it on the ballot. So we had, we were out on the street corners and the shopping centers every weekend collecting signatures, and then campaigning for the initiative, which lost, of course, as we expected. But it did bring together I think it had an incredible educational and publicity effect, and also brought so many new people into the organization to work on the initiative campaign. So that was a really, I think for some of the people involved in the campaign, the loss felt like a defeat. But for those of us who had started the campaign, we knew we were going to lose from the very beginning. The purpose wasn't really to win. The purpose was to educate.
Looking back at the politics of the Palestinian movements, particularly in US university campus, how does it feel? It seems to me that it has grown massively. Back in the days, it used to be very, very minor, if at all, anything. How do you feel about it? Has it become stronger, or has the backlash also become stronger? What's your take on that?
The movement has definitely become stronger. And, I said that after I left Berkeley, I pulled back somewhat. And one of the reasons is, at Berkeley, I was an undergrad and then a graduate student. So I was I felt like I had a lot of academic freedom as a student to be very vocal and very politically involved and very visible on campus. Then I got a job as an assistant professor at a small college in Maine. And I thought to myself, I'm not going to be able to do this when I go there because I'm going to sabotage my career. And I think that when I start this job, I'm just going to have to focus on Central America and Cuba. solidarity, because that's something that, my degree was in Latin American history, and my job was teaching Latin American history, and that was something I would be able to integrate into my professional self as a professor of Latin American history in a way that would not sabotage my career. Like, I could remain politically active, but I really felt that it was going to be very hard. And once I got to Maine, that was sort of confirmed to me. And my resolution to stay out of Middle East politics, or stay quiet on Middle East politics, lasted. I started the job in the fall of 1990. My resolution lasted until January of 1991, when the first US invasion of Iraq. And I had sort of quietly found one ally on campus, somebody who was in the same position as me. It was the college chaplain. He also started that same year as I did. So he was new to campus, and he had been really involved in Palestinian rights I think he was at University of Chicago or someplace in Chicago, and had decided on coming here. He was going to have to just tone it down. But we talked that day, and the college canceled classes the following day, and said, invited faculty to do talks and, events, conversations with students about what was happening. And so the chaplain and I decided we were going to do a panel on Israel, Palestine, and the current crisis, or Israel, Palestine, and the US invasion of Iraq, or something. Why Israel, Palestine was central to this. And it went really well. It had a good audience. But I was later told by the chair of my department in no uncertain terms that I was not to do that anymore. And he said something, and this was in a formal letter that was shared with my tenure committee, my pre-tenure review committee, and everything. He said that at a college like this, we have to be very careful of what we say, not only in the classroom, but also outside of the classroom, because students could feel silenced by our opinions. It's like, okay, so not only do I not have freedom of speech in the classroom, I don't have freedom of speech outside the classroom anymore. But yeah, I felt in a vulnerable position, and like I had to tone it down again. But your question was, so, I think a bunch of things have changed. Certainly, activism for Palestinian rights and understanding of Palestinian rights as a social justice issue has greatly increased. I'm not sure I can even say that the attempts to quash pro-Palestinian organizing have increased, because they were there all along. It was pretty much constant when we were active at Berkeley, which was why I went through that thought process of, okay, when I start my new job, I'm going to have to be more quiet about this. But I do think that certain types of sensibilities have changed, so that the like accusations of anti-Semitism against pro-Palestinian organizing have been there forever. But I feel like there's a cultural shift in which the desire to not offend anybody ever, and the idea that challenges to ideas are offensive and threatening and dangerous, I do feel like that has grown, and or been added to the conversation in a new way.
Sorry, are you talking about the sort of a right-wing backlash against, let's say, queer activism, black activism, where there is also this idea that, the sort of somewhat left-wing, version is also intolerant to dissent? Are you talking about that, or are you talking about a traditional right-wing reactionary backlash?
Um, I think what I'm talking about kind of transcends left and right. It's kind of a therapization of politics that I think um, both across the political spectrum, people are vulnerable to. And the idea that um, offending someone is the worst crime that could be committed. And so I was reading um, a survey of student culture about freedom of speech. And, the right-wing narrative is that, well, faculty are so left-wing that right-wing students are afraid to say anything in class because they'll be. But what the survey found was that very few students were afraid of being silenced or felt that they were silenced by faculty. They felt that they were silenced by other students because they were so afraid of saying something that another student would not like, and that they would then be, that their lives would then be ruined. And, I think the rise of the internet, social media, of course, has given people access to sources of news that were really hard to get in previous generations. But it's also increased the vulnerability to cyberbullying. And, if you use the wrong word, you're afraid you're suddenly going to become an international pariah. So I guess, okay, so I'll just tell you something that happened at my university. My department chair, on my encouragement, decided shortly after, like in November, that we should do a department panel on Israel and Gaza. We're a fairly large history department with a lot of people who studied things that could be quite relevant to this issue, and from different angles. And we did a panel shortly after the Russian invasion of Ukraine, in which, we certainly don't all agree with each other, but we, presented different historical perspectives on the issue. And I talked about the global South, how the global South saw the Russia-Ukraine war, or the Russian invasion of Ukraine. For 3 months, the chair begged the department to step up and participate in this panel. And I was the only one who agreed to do it. And he finally gave up. He said, no one will do it. And just so, and I know from talking with members of the administration that the university, so I've given a couple of talks, 3 talks on campus since October 7th. I am the only person who has given a talk on campus since October 7th. And I've heard from the administration that they're under a lot of pressure from outside, from organized pro-Israel groups, that saying that the university's position has not been balanced and that they have to have balance. And they said they're really frustrated, but nobody else will agree to say anything. So I feel like that kind of, why are tenured faculty afraid of speaking out? When I was a young new professor waiting to get tenure, I understand why I or other faculty in vulnerable positions, people who don't have job security, people who are adjuncts, people who have not gone through the tenure process, but we're a pretty old faculty at Salem State because of demographic trends. We've been doing very little new hiring over the past 10 or 15 years. So practically everybody has tenure. And why are people afraid to say anything? And that just seems really different to me from the 1980s.
Right. And that's going on even with universities like Harvard. It's not just the smaller colleges where, things don't blow up in the media. It can be like even in Harvard where, everyone knows what's going on, and generally faculties are in a better position, it seems, at least.
And the sort of witch hunt against potential anti-Semitism, like, yes, accusations of anti-Semitism, we got those all the time back in the 80s. You know, if you say anything about Palestinian rights, you're anti-Semitic. But the kind of witch hunts aimed at individuals that we're seeing now, um, that that seem to be going unchallenged, yeah, that feels new to me.
Fast forwarding a little bit, you made your first visit to the Middle East in 2010, which with your father, you guys were going to the West Bank and you were stopped at the checkpost. Tell us a little bit about what happened at the checkpost, and then you ended up in Beirut. You saw the refugee camp. So if you could also tell us a little bit about what those refugee camps are. What did you feel?
Yeah. So the trip was organized because my dad was invited to give several talks um, in Jordan, in Beirut, in Amman, in Beirut, and at Birzeit University. And Birzeit University was kind of the center of the trip. But the organizers of the event said, we actually recommend that you do not fly to Tel Aviv because we're afraid that you're going to be turned back, that Israel's not going to let you in. So we recommend that you fly to Amman, organize some events there, and then cross by land over the Allenby Bridge into the West Bank, because that way, if you're turned back, you can still do the rest of your trip. You know, you can do the Amman part of your trip, you can do the Beirut part of your trip. You don't want to be sent back to New York. It's a lot better to be sent back to Amman. So, so that's what we did. We flew to Amman. A couple days later, we went by taxi to the Allenby Bridge, and there were four of us traveling together. And if you have a US passport, it's pretty automatic that they just stamp your passport and let you in. So the young woman at the immigration line there stamped our passports, all four of us. And then she noticed the name. And she said, oh, wait a minute, I need to check something. And she took the passports and went into a back room and stayed there for a long time. And then finally came back with the passports restamped. So where it said, where the entry stamp was, it was stamped over it or crossed out. And then there was a stamp next to it saying entry denied. And oh, no. That happened later. This was a long time ago. Okay, I'm putting the memories back together. Okay, so then she said, we're going to have to look into your case, and can you go wait in this room over here? So the people who invited us had paid extra for us to have VIP status. So we had little VIP stamps on our passport. So we got sent to the VIP detention room instead of the regular detention room, which I don't know what the regular one was like, but the VIP one was a very comfortable room. There was a coffee machine. We had internet access. So we sat there for about 5 hours in the detention room, and every hour or so, somebody would come and interrogate us and ask, why are you giving a talk at Birzeit University? And what are you going to talk about? And on and on and on. And finally, at the end, they brought our passports back with those stamps, where the entry stamp had big red lines through it, and then there was a stamp next to it saying entry denied. And they actually said that if the other three of us wanted to enter Israel, we'd be allowed to, but not my father. But obviously, the only reason we were going there was because we were accompanying him and for his talk at Birzeit. So. And they actually said to him, why don't you give a talk at Tel Aviv University? Why don't you give it a talk? Why do you have to give a talk at a Palestinian university? He said, well, I've given talks at Israeli universities many times, but this time I was invited to give a talk at a Palestinian university. But why? Anyway, it just went on and on. So yeah, we went back to Amman, and he was able to do the talk again by video conferencing. It was a little less technologically advanced than it is now, but it worked. So he gave the talk virtually, and then we went on to Beirut, which was the other part of the trip, where he also had some talks and meetings scheduled, and part of it was with Lebanese academics to visit the the refugee camps, Burja Barajna and the Shatila refugee camps. So yeah, I think people in the United States who've never visited a refugee camp have an image of like tents. But it was really brought home to me that these were refugee camps that have been camps since 1948. And they're more like poor, overcrowded neighborhoods. So there's a lot of concrete and buildings, and there's businesses and electrical wires hanging all over the place. And but just seeing the immediacy of 1948 to people who were in these camps, generations of people who were in these camps, children, and they're so crowded that I remember my dad commenting, like, there's children here who like never see the sun because the alleyways between the tall buildings are so narrow, like there's never sun coming down, and the buildings are so concentrated. Generations of children who are growing up without ever seeing the sun. And, they're almost like walled ghettos. The people in the camps do not have citizenship, so they can't work. They don't have access to even children born because, citizenship by birth is not a universal phenomenon. So these are generations of stateless people growing up in these sort of semi-ungoverned and ungovernable areas, locked out of the city that they live in. And you might wonder why 194 is like plastered all over the walls everywhere. 194 was the UN resolution after the 1948 war, guaranteeing Palestinian refugees, Palestinians who've been driven out in 1948, the right to return. Why are people so obsessed with 194 and something that happened in 1948? Because they are still refugees, they are still stateless, they are still homeless and living under really indefensible conditions. And so this people who have the keys to their houses when they were driven out from in 1948, hanging on the walls of their little concrete apartments in these refugee camps. And of course, the Shatila refugee camp was also the site of the massacre, along with the Sabra refugee camp during the 1982 Israeli invasion of Lebanon. So that was really, just for me, having been so involved at the time, to find myself actually there and that's the only time I've been to the Middle East. So I've never been to Israel or the occupied territories.
The walls were full of graffitis. I could see UN 194 all over. And so there is this very visible, it's very visible that the community still longs to return, the right of return. And this is something very striking. I thought about, what came to my mind is the people of Bangladeshi origin in my home state of Assam in India, where they were not displaced people, they were not refugees. Now attempts are being made to turn them into stateless people. And it's quite the contrary. I mean, when you speak to them, they almost have no sense of what Bangladesh is, where they came from. Obviously, they are not in refugees. They came as peasants, they settled down, they have been here all the time. And your story was exactly the opposite. There is a very strong sense of the right to return. Um, I think, Professor Chomsky, here, I wanted to start with placing colonialism at the center of the whole story, because you have been writing, teaching, speaking about colonialism all over. And I was thinking, placing colonialism at the center allows us to see what has happened over the years, so it gives us a better sense of history, but it also builds a South-South collaboration, because for many of us in Asia, in Latin America, in Africa, uh, these are people of uh, or let's say victims of colonization. So if you could give us a few parallels with other places or a sense of history, and tell us why is it so important to place colonization at the center of our analysis.
So, those of us who study colonialism, and, I think that the concept of colonialism has also entered the popular social justice discourse in new ways. And especially the concept of settler colonialism. So I would say there's kind of an academic track and a popular track that don't always completely correspond, because the academic track tends to be much more specific and nuanced, and the popular track is just like everything is colonialism. Well, I actually think that everything is colonialism, but to me that means there's just so many things to study rather than to just sort of dismiss everything as colonialism. But that the way it's entered the popular sphere has also created a backlash where, because some people use the term kind of unthinkingly or like in a flattened kind of way, that, well, we can't talk about it at all. And I actually, one of my projects this past summer was to create a faculty development seminar for my department that I called originally Decolonizing the Curriculum. And the idea was that it would be for faculty in my department to talk about colonialism and how it affects the way that we teach, because we're a very global department and we teach a lot of world history classes. So just looking at different moments of history and how colonial ideologies have affected the way we have constructed those histories, and how we could rethink how we teach different things like, World War I, World War II, immigration, by bringing in the perspective of colonialism. And one of my colleagues said, well, I don't think we can call this decolonizing the curriculum because that's very ideological. We have to think of another name for this workshop. And I wanted to argue, but then I thought, well, no, this isn't a hill I want to die on. Let's call it centering the global majority. And everybody agreed, yes, let's call it centering the global majority. That's much less ideological than decolonizing the curriculum. But, one course that I teach is Colonialism and the Making of the Modern World. And I started teaching that course way back in the early not 1990s, in the late 1990s, before colonialism had become kind of such a buzzword. And, Maxime Rodenson's book, Israel, a Settler Colonial State, was written back in the 1980s. But that concept of using settler, and, I was in graduate school in the 1980s and we studied settler colonialism, but only with regard to South Africa. Like nobody talked about the United States as a settler colonial society. But I do think that some of the, so the course I developed shortly after I started teaching world history was Colonialism and the Making of the Modern World. And, the basic argument of the course is that the modern world was made by colonialism. And like, in some ways that is just so obvious that is true. But we look at specific case studies and specific issues and see how colonialism made the modern world. And we also look at settler colonialism. And a lot of my academic work has actually looked at settler colonialism. And I also teach a course on indigenous histories of the Americas, North and South America. So looking at like Native American history in the United States and indigenous histories in Latin America have been really separate fields. But so my course looks at, okay, so where do these two academic disciplines intersect? And, US Native American history, settler colonialism has become the dominant paradigm for understanding this. In Latin America, much less so. But I argue that that both sides can learn from both scholarships can learn from each other in terms of how do we understand even defining indigeneity and seeing how categories are constructed and specific indigenous histories. So, for studying Israel, Palestine, I feel like the concepts of colonialism and settler colonialism are almost too obvious. So then they get used in kind of superficial ways, but they're nonetheless, the fact that they're obvious doesn't mean that they're not true and not really useful for understanding what's happening. But a lot of critiques of Palestinian rights organizing say, well, they said Israel's colonial or Zionism is colonialism, so we're not going to listen to them at all. Well, Zionism is obviously colonialism. If you read the early Zionists, that's all they talk about is how they want to colonize and how it's a colonial project. It's like, how can you even begin to deny that? So, you can't claim that it's racist or anti-Semitic to say that Zionism is colonialism. All the Zionists said they were colonizers. The 19th century and early 20th century Zionists. So, the paradigm of settler colonialism has a couple of pillars to distinguish settler colonialism from other kinds of colonialism, as in India, for example, where the goal of the British was not to eliminate and replace the native population, but rather to rule over the native population. So settler colonialism is premised on the logic, everybody quotes Patrick Wolf's book, the logic of elimination, that the native population has to be removed, eliminated, and it's also a history of erasure, that is the history of the native population has to be erased, their very existence has to be denied, and replaced by a European immigrant population, a European colonizing population, because, the term immigrant could mean just they're coming from Europe, but colonialism is different from immigration because immigrants go to move into an existing society, whereas colonizers go to either rule over or eliminate and replace the existing society. So, I think that understanding what settler colonialism is and how it's worked in different contexts is really helpful to illuminate what Zionism meant in the late 19th century and early 20th century, and on into the present. Like, if we understand the current Israeli war on Gaza in the context of a century or more than a century of settler colonialism, it's like, yeah, you destroy houses, you destroy institutions, you kill people, you drive them out, you starve them, you dehumanize them. Like, that is settler colonialism. So, yeah, I think that, and I think the affinity of the United States for Israel has some very contemporary geostrategic reasons why the United States wanted, as Kissinger put it, boots on the ground in the oil-rich Middle East, or as Alexander Haig put it in the 1980s, it was Kissinger who said cop on the beat, boots on the ground. Haig said that Israel would be the United States' unsinkable aircraft carrier in the Middle East. But there's also a very ideological, cultural affinity of this idea that, oh, Israel is the only democracy and Israel is so modern, and the sense that Israelis are like people like us, like white people, like modern colonizers who have to deal with these primitive savages, that kind of consciousness is really deeply ingrained in the United States, and not only in white people in the United States. One of the really interesting books that uses settler colonialism is Elena Roberts. Been There All the While, I think, is the title of her book, but it's about African Americans on native lands in Oklahoma. And, a lot of people now, not when I was growing up, we never learned this, but now I think it's become more commonly taught and discussed and part of the popular consciousness that there was a huge race massacre in 1921 in Tulsa, Oklahoma. And that Tulsa, have you heard about that? It hasn't gotten that far, but it is something that has become more part of common knowledge in the United States, I think. Something that kids will hear mentioned in school. So Tulsa, Oklahoma was it was in 1921, which was a period of heightened racial violence, white racial violence in the United States, the Ku Klux Klan and lynchings. But the massacre in Tulsa, where hundreds of African Americans were killed, businesses, like it was called the Black Wall Street. It was like Tulsa was really a center of Black economic and cultural flourishing in the United States in this era of Jim Crow and heightened racism. So, I knew about the Tulsa massacre, and yet it never occurred to me to wonder why Tulsa? Why was Tulsa, Oklahoma, such a center? Well, the reason, which you can learn by reading Elena Roberts's book, is that Tulsa, Oklahoma, was Indian country. And the commitment of the federal government to Reconstruction, which was the idea after the Civil War in the 1860s, 1870s, that the US South would be reconstructed to create racial democracy in the South, to open political rights for free Black people, to open educational rights, to restructure, reconstruct the South. But in the US South, the federal government was unwilling to actually enforce Reconstruction, and white supremacy demolished the brief experiment in Reconstruction. But in Indian country, the federal government was willing to enforce Reconstruction. So Indian country became the one place where freed slaves actually got land, where they got access to political rights, where they got access to education. And so Indian country also became a magnet for people fleeing the South. So, we talk about the Great Migration that starts, in the context of the racist reaction to Reconstruction. A lot of this went not only to the Northeast, but also to the West. And a lot of it went to Oklahoma, because that is the only place that Black people could get land in the entire country, was in Indian country, because the federal government was using Black people and Black migrants as part of its settler colonial project to erase Indian sovereignty. So yeah, there's all kinds of complexities to settler colonialism that are just really important for understanding. But yet, the basic premises of the concept are so powerful for understanding the United States as a country, and how racism works in the United States, and this kind of racial colonial affinity with Israel. And one of the themes in my class, because we look at specific cases of both traditional classic colonialism and settler colonialism, is the racial ideologies that go along with it. And this, white supremacy is another term that in the popular sphere is, I wouldn't say overused, but is sometimes flattened or oversimplified. But, we try to really delve into what is white supremacy in the class. And so just two of the books we read on Africa, we read Chinua Achebe's Things Fall Apart. And we really interrogate that book on white supremacy, among other things. We interrogate it on many things. And then we read a book about the United States called Bad Indians, a tribal memoir. And so we try to really drill down into how does white supremacy work in settler colonial, as an ideology in settler colonial and enfranchised colonial contexts, and what does it have in common and how is it different? You're muted.
I'm sorry. Yeah. So just to ask a follow-up question on this, since you said there are ways to be specific about what is colonialism or settler colonialism, thinking about Israel Palestine now, I mean, obviously the project was so obviously settler colonialism. If we go back to the maybe late 19th century, early 20th century, or the moment of Balfour Declaration, or even as late as 1948, it's obviously settler colonialism. Uh, but things have moved ever since. Today we have Israel proper, where the Arab Palestinians are discriminated by maybe a dozen discriminatory laws. But it's a different setting than um, expansion of settlers in the West Bank. And then there is Gaza, which was occupied for a long time, and then there is a formal deoccupation, but still it is controlled indirectly through airspace, through resources, through military checkpoints. So, what are we talking about in the context of? Are we talking about the whole project, everything, or should we be specific about something when we apply the concept of settler colonialism today in the context of Israel and Palestine?
So, I like to, the organization that we formed here on campus is called, and it's part of a national network, Students for Justice in Palestine. And I think that like the word justice is really central to me. And that we basically have three different groups of Palestinians who are treated unjustly by Israel. There's Palestinians inside 48, right? Inside the borders that were established by Israel in 1948, who, as you said, have certain rights, but not full rights of citizenship. But certainly more rights and freedoms than do Palestinians in the occupied territories, the West Bank and Gaza. And that's the second group. And then the third group is Palestinians in the diaspora who cannot return.
We are talking about Jordan, Lebanon, Syria, and elsewhere.
Those who are refugees living in refugee camps, like in those countries, but also even Palestinians in the United States who are not living in refugee camps and might have really great lives in the United States, but they cannot go and visit their relatives. So they're still discriminated against by Israel in ways that they may not be. Well, I mean, Palestinians in the United States also face racial violence, as we've seen. A little boy in Chicago, 3 students in Vermont. They're not immune from racial violence, but in terms of the structural discrimination of settler colonialism, we have Trump's Muslim ban. There's all kinds of structural things too, but not the kind of systemic structural racism as exists in Israel in terms of being deliberately excluded from certain rights of society because they are Palestinian. So I think both colonialism and settler colonialism are useful concepts for helping us understand what's going on in all of these contexts. So inside 1948, there's this idea that Israel can be both a Jewish state and a democratic state. Now, to me, that's a contradiction in terms. If it is a Jewish state, that means that there are rights for Jews that don't exist for non-Jews. Otherwise, what makes it Jewish? What makes a state Jewish? Now, some of those discriminatory rights are enshrined in its immigration laws and its sense that Israel is somehow the state of all Jews. So all Jews have the right to immigrate to Israel and become citizens of Israel, whereas Palestinians, no matter when they were expelled, do not have that right and do not even have the right to enter, much less to become citizens and live in Israel. And And then there's the whole slew of discriminatory laws about where people can live and what kinds of jobs people can have. And then there's social discrimination, and there's funding inequalities in terms of schools. And there's, the nation state law saying Israel is the country of all Jews. Well, what about the people who are not Jews? So if we see Israel as, one difference between Israel and other settler colonial examples like the United States, South Africa, Australia, New Zealand, Canada, is that in the post-World War II period, there has been a reckoning with settler colonialism and an attempt to dismantle the structural discrimination of settler colonialism. So in the United States, for example, you have the ending after World War II of the boarding school program that forcibly took Indian children and from their families to place them in boarding schools. You have ICWA, the Indian Child Welfare Act, passed, which tries to dismantle the social service commitment to taking Indian children from their families, and the racism inherent in the way social welfare agencies in the United States construct Indian families as defective and neglectful to justify taking children away to put into foster care or put into adoption. So, and to prohibit those discriminatory mechanisms. And, in Canada and Australia, there's been even further steps. There's been truth commissions trying to uncover the centuries of atrocities committed against Indigenous people. There's been really strong Indigenous rights movements that have gained. So yeah, there's been the same thing with the African American population in the United States. After World War II, there were some pretty systemic attempts to try to dismantle at least the legal structures of segregation. Right. In Israel, it's been the opposite. Like, all those things were created after World War II. So, the United States can say, well, we're looking back, we're making land acknowledgements, we're recognizing the crimes committed in the past. But in Israel, those are being implemented just as they're being dismantled elsewhere. So the timing is, I think, really important, because after World War II, there really is this kind of international consensus, like, we don't want this to happen again. Look at all the terrible things we've done. Let's try to make things more just and more right. But Israel's kind of an exception to that. Like, no, we're going to do them now.
Right.
Then there are the people who have been living under military occupation since so that's one group of Palestinians who are still living with the colonial realities that were established after World War II, rather than being in a context where those colonial, and they are being strengthened, like the nation state law of 2018, creates more structures of discrimination in Israel. Then there's the people who've been living under military occupation since 1967. And, we're doing a Palestine Film Festival on campus and looking at some documentaries from the 1980s filmed on the West Bank and in Gaza. It's like, wow, like, this has been going, like, what's happening now is not new. It has been going on permanently, and for decade after decade after decade of what living under military occupation means. I feel like we've almost kind of normalized, oh yeah, the occupied territories, but no, the violence of occupation is permanent. In the West Bank, the settlements themselves show this idea of settler colonialism, of removing the local population, erasing the local population, and replacing it. In Gaza, since 2005, the settlements have been dismantled, but the goal of eliminating the native population is happening before our very eyes right now. And then, of course, for Palestinians in the diaspora, I think the denial of the right of return is almost the essence of settler colonialism. And, Israel calls it the demographic problem, it's kind of sanitized way of looking at it. But like, we do not want Palestinians here. And that is like really essential to settler colonialism.
So, I guess I wanted to ask you about the discontinuity. I mean, we have been talking about how the occupation, the brutalization, it has been going on in so many ways, and yet, if we could reflect a little bit on what has happened since October 7 can be also moments of discontinuity, because if you look at the scale of violence, I mean, the numbers, earlier we used to talk about 2008, 2014, where maybe 2,200, we are talking about 1,400. And this has become, I mean, this has become so large scale. It's not even comparable, like 30,000, almost 90%, 95% of the population got displaced. And I'm wondering if this is some sort of a discontinuity too. I mean, I'm thinking about those in camps in Beirut whose resilience or whose resolution to return, what would have happened when they are seeing their Palestinian brothers in Gaza being constantly pushed around towards south, but also the south being bombed. So what are your thoughts about the scale and intensity of this violence? I mean, a lot of people are comparing it with the Nakba of the 1948. One of the, and that's true. I mean, it's ongoing. But here, what we are really seeing is not the militias. We talk about these massacres in 1948 through militias, and here we're seeing professional IDF using bunker busters, bombing, incinerating people. What has changed since last few months?
Well, I mean, certainly one thing that has changed since World War II, and the Nakba, which followed World War II several years later, is just the technology of war.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so, one thing where you can actually see progress, and I'm using that word in quotation marks, in human history is in technology. Like, our technology keeps getting better and better, but our technology of mass destruction also keeps getting, I hate to use the word better, but I don't know what other word to use, like stronger and stronger. So our capacity to engage in mass killing increases, I would say. So that's one of the things that's happening. The first film we showed in our film festival was called Gaza Fights for Freedom by Abby Martin, directed by Abby Martin. And it was filmed in 2018 during the Great March of Return, which was a months-long nonviolent Palestinian protest, going up to the militarized border with Israel, where people went up to the militarized border, and Israel responded, incredibly violently, and hundreds of people were killed. And when you look at the statistics that they're giving back in 2018, 2019, it's like, 5 medics have been killed, 2 journalists have been killed. And this was horrifying in 2018. And now, we're talking about hundreds of journalists being killed and hundreds of, when the first news came out about the bombing of Al-Shifa Hospital, and the world was outraged, and then it was like, who did it? And now, like, we've become so numbed to the destruction of hospitals, and there's no big moral outrage every time Israel flattens a hospital and kills everybody in it in Gaza anymore. So, if you want to just talk about numbers comparing to the Nakba, where maybe fewer than 1 million people were displaced. Now more than 1 million people have been displaced. If you want to talk about the destruction of the possibility of life, you could talk about the destruction of villages in and areas of cities in 1947, 48, and now you're talking about the entire Gaza Strip being basically flattened, so that the possibility of human life there has been destroyed. You can also talk about the visibility of what's happening, because now the world does know, and the world does have institutions like the International Court of Justice and the United Nations. You can talk about the role of the United States that has been systematically undercutting any international attempt to stop Israel. And to me, even worse than the US continual veto of ceasefire resolutions, and I guess I can't say worse than the continued flow of arms to Israel, both with and without congressional approval, because we've just recently come to light all of the arms shipments that have, because they were under a certain amount, have been able to go without even any public acknowledgement or congressional approval. But of course, we also have the overwhelming approval in Congress. Is the US decision to defund UNRWA the day after the ICJ decision about humanitarian aid, and just the ludicrousness of the idea that the United States wants to bypass Israel to find a way to get aid into Gaza, when it's the US that is funding and supplying Israel's destruction of Gaza. Like, how can you say you're giving humanitarian aid and this idea of a humanitarian pause instead of a ceasefire? Or now Biden started using the word ceasefire, but he always qualifies it like, I don't mean permanent. Of course, we can't have a permanent ceasefire. We want Israel to keep bombing. Just the infuriating ludicrousness and insanity, and the fact that so much of the US population is able to just kind of go along with it is just really, really horrifying.
I wanted to quickly ask you about our choices of words as far as this conflict is concerned. And I think from my sort of vague memory about Herman Chomsky's manufacturing consent, one of the pillars, I mean, there are various pillars, corporate structure, situation where journalists are situated and so on and so forth. One of them were this anti-communism label, kind of. I mean, that would be used against any dissent and so on. We are seeing a lot of those labels here in what we are seeing. What are some of these helpful and unhelpful categories insofar as this conflict is concerned?
Well, of course, with the collapse of the socialist bloc and the Soviet Union, and the supposed end of the Cold War, although the Cold War has not ended, communism has just been replaced by, I mean, there's
authoritarianism,
but I was also thinking about, even earlier, like in the 1990s, communism was replaced by drug traffickers and terrorists, and terrorist keeps coming up again and again. And terrorist is an eminently colonial terminology, because it basically is a way of defining military actions by non-state actors. So states are like the inventions of colonizers. So when the people they're colonizing retaliate against state violence, it's called terrorism.
I remember, as you take your sip of tea, I remember doing a very short sort of research about the genealogy of the word terrorism in South Asia, and I found as late as the late 19th century, where indigenous tribes were trying to resist British colonial land revenue policies. These are basically either settling, expanding agriculture into tribal heartlands, and they were labeled as fanatics, as criminal tribes, and eventually words like terror was constantly used. So just to uh, pitch that as you took your sip of tea. Go on.
So, I was mentioning Chinua Achebe's book, Things Fall Apart, that we read in my class. And so the book ends with the British district commissioner writing a book about his experience as a colonizer, whereas the whole Things Fall Apart takes place from the perspective of the people being colonized. And so the district commissioner decides he's going to title his book, The Pacification of the Primitive Tribes of the Lower Niger. And we come back to that book title like throughout the semester to talk about like colonial ideologies and like pacification. Like the people who we want to colonize are inherently violent, so we have to pacify them. How that ideology works. And I think that is still very much with us. So I do feel like there is, Edward Said's Orientalism obviously was a really important part of analyzing this, and also his covering Islam. The ways, but that the Orient was constructed as a colonizable territory, the way that Islam has been constructed as a colonizable religion, and these tropes about fanaticism and violence coming out of the people we want to colonize. Oh, and that they don't care about human life, like we heard that in Vietnam, right, from the United States, like they don't value human life the way we do. So this whole set of colonial ideologies is very much part of European culture and US culture, and is continually mobilized. So, anti-communism was directed primarily not at the USSR or even China, but primarily at the third world, at third world revolutionary movements. So communism was used in the same way as a colonial ideology.
Also, the labor movement inside the US.
Yes. Although nowhere near as violently as right. In the third world. And of course, against Black liberation movements and Native American liberation movements. And then, drug trafficking and terrorism, and like, there's always a dangerous enemy out there that justifies US control of what the US has constructed as people in need of colonization. Whether it's Native Americans, and there's I'm blanking on the author now, but there's another really interesting book called The First Way of War, that looks at how the Indian wars, like the United States is continually fighting the Indian wars. So they were fighting the Indian wars in the Philippines, after 1898, and they're fighting the Indian wars in Vietnam, and they're fighting the Indian wars in Iraq, and they're fighting the Indian wars in Afghanistan. And, we're fighting the Indian wars in Gaza right now. So yeah, those colonial and settler colonial ideologies, I think, are really deeply embedded in our culture and society, and they're on the front page of the New York Times every single day.
Mm-hmm. I think we're coming to an end. I just wanted to ask you about the two or maybe even three charters, the original Hamas charter of late 1980s, the Likud charter, and also was it 2017 where Hamas came up with the new, relatively more progressive charter, if you like. Can you tell us a little bit about these three charters? Because a lot has been made up and made out about these charters.
Yeah. So, Hamas, well, first, let me just talk about the first, the 1977 Likud founding charter, the Likud is, of course, Benjamin Netanyahu's party, the governing party in Israel now and over the past 20 years primarily. Founded in 1977, the Likud charter says that between the sea and the Jordan, there will only be Israeli sovereignty. Now, the sea and the Jordan, that might sound familiar to you because that means between the river and the sea. So not only did the Likud party announce in 1977 that there will be only Israeli sovereignty between the river and the sea, but that is also enacted. Like since 1967, for over 50 years, there has been only Israeli sovereignty between the river and the sea. Whether it's inside 48 or in the occupied territories. That is the facts on the ground. Israel has created those facts on the ground is not only said they want those facts on the ground, but has created those facts on the ground of only Israeli sovereignty between the river and the sea. And this was updated in 1999 in the Likud charter or the 1999 electoral platform. The Jordan River will be the permanent eastern border of the state of Israel. Jerusalem is the eternal united capital of the state of Israel and only of Israel. The government will flatly reject Palestinian proposals to divide Jerusalem. The government of Israel flatly rejects the establishment of a Palestinian state west of the Jordan River. So it's not just something they said in 1977, it's something they have repeatedly reiterated, and Netanyahu continues reiterating it today. And it also is the reality that Israel has created. There is only one state, and it's the Israeli state between the river and the sea. So the kind of panic that we hear from Palestinian rights activists calling for Palestine will be free from the river to the sea is really ludicrous if you look at what is actually happening between the river and the sea, which is that there's no freedom for Palestinians anywhere between the river and the sea. And of course, Palestinians should be free everywhere. They should be free in the United States. They should be free in India. They should be free wherever they are, including in historic Palestine. So, to say that people should be free is very different from saying that people should kill other people. Nobody's saying that Palestinians should kill all Jews between the river and the sea. But that Palestinians should be free, of course they should be free. So the 1988 Hamas charter is indeed almost a parody of a classic anti-Semitic document. It says our enemies are the Jews. We need to kill all the Jews. It draws on centuries of European anti-Semitism. It says the Jews were responsible for World War I, they were responsible for World War II, they have all these secret societies, the protocols of the elders of Zion, like every European anti-Semitic invention of the 19th and 20th centuries is there in the 1988 Hamas Charter. It's clearly an anti-Semitic document. But what does it actually mean? In terms of what was Hamas in 1988, what is Hamas today? What has Hamas actually done in the territories where it has had a certain degree of local governing power? And in particular, what happened I would say that okay, before I get to October 7th, and even some of the resistance before October 7th, like the Great March of Return, which I had just mentioned, because Hamas is engaged in both violent and nonviolent resistance. Hamas runs hospitals, Hamas runs food distribution programs, it runs schools, it runs universities. So basically, Hamas is different from all other governments in the world in that it's not sovereign. So it can't control its borders. It can't control it can't control trade. It can't control a lot of things that are part of sovereignty. But in terms of local governance, Hamas pretty much does what every other government does. It has a military wing and it governs. It collects trash. Okay. So let me just quote, though, from the Hamas charter, the covenant as it was updated in 2017. I'm just trying to pull it up here because I want to quote from it directly. Hamas affirms, this is 2017 document of general principles and policies. Hamas affirms that its conflict is with the Zionist project, not with the Jews because of their religion. Hamas does not wage a struggle against the Jews because they are Jewish, but wages a struggle against the Zionists who occupy Palestine. So in the 2017 document, the organization has evolved clearly through its, the time when it was a small group of people in 1988, through its taking on of certain governmental capacities since 2005. It goes on. Hamas believes that no part of the land of Palestine should be compromised or conceded. Hamas rejects any alternative to the full and complete liberation of Palestine from the river to the sea. So they do say that. However, this very same paragraph goes on. Without compromising its rejection of the Zionist entity and without relinquishing any Palestinian rights, Hamas considers the establishment of a fully sovereign and independent Palestinian state with Jerusalem as its capital along the lines of the 4th of June, 1967, with the return of the refugees and the displaced to their homes from which they were expelled, to be a formula for national consensus. So Hamas, with some reservations, accepts a two-state solution. Now, personally, I don't take a position for or against a two-state solution. I think that the Biden administration is making a big mistake by putting all its eggs in the basket of the United States is going to enforce a two-state solution. I don't think that's the job of the United States. And, I was just talking to a friend about this yesterday. The question is, can Israel be a Jewish and democratic state? Well, right now it's not. And I actually don't see how it can be. But maybe Israel can be Jewish and democratic without being a state. Don't we need to think beyond the question of the state and exactly what the state? Anyway, that's a different question. But, I think that if we look closely at 2018, which was an example of nonviolent mass mobilization, outside of Hamas, that is, the Great March of Return was not a Hamas organized activity. It really transcended political parties in Gaza. But if we look at October 7th, that is, October 7th began as an attack on Israeli military bases, right? Mm-hmm. And then moved into settlements where not only Jews were attacked, but Thai migrant workers were killed and taken hostage. That is, Hamas did, and the other organizations that accompanied Hamas on October 7th did not go looking for Jews. They went looking for hostages. And if you look at what were the stated and clearly rational decision-making process into planning October 7th, some of the things that were going on were the highest violence rates against Palestinians in the West Bank in many years. That is, Israeli military actions and settler violence against Palestinians in the West Bank. It's been the complete US commitment to writing the Palestinian cause out of the narrative and promoting what were called the Abraham Accords of normalizing Israel's relations with other Arab countries without any attention to the Palestinian issue. The decades-long siege of Gaza. So there are a lot of reasons why Hamas attacked on October 7th that have nothing to do with anti-Semitism. So the anti-Semitism of the 1988 charter was eliminated from the 2017 covenant. And very clearly, Zionism as a political project, which inherently is a colonial and racist project. And so this also just brings me to the question of, like, Hamas is often constructed as calling for the elimination of the state of Israel. And 194 is often constructed as calling for the elimination of the state of Israel, because Israel cannot be a Jewish and democratic state if it allows Palestinians to return, because it'll no longer be Jewish.
Also, the demographic problem that it also
Yes, that's exactly what I mean. What Israelis call the demographic problem, which is, more accurately called the problem of maintaining Jewish supremacy. The demographic problem makes it sound like the Palestinians are the problem. No, the problem is that Jews want to maintain what they call a Jewish and democratic state, democracy for Jews. But look at the history of the United States. The United States was established as explicitly a white supremacist project, right? Only white people could be citizens, only white people could own land, only white people had rights. And very much too slowly, over the course of centuries, that white supremacist project has been bit by bit chipped away from, so that the explicitly white supremacist project of the United States has been, to a large extent, dismantled, except in immigration border policies. That's where the legal structures of white supremacy are still enacted. And that doesn't mean that the United States has become a paragon of racial harmony. Obviously, it hasn't. Obviously, even changing the laws doesn't change the realities on the ground. And, the structural racism is still very much a part of the United States. But there are mechanisms for challenging that, and it's not inscribed in the law in the way it has been in the past. So there's a lot to criticize about the United States, but in legal terms, it's not a white supremacist state anymore.
Mm-hmm.
Does that mean the United States was destroyed? I would say it means that the United States has transformed to become less white supremacist and more democratic. And I think that rather than understanding calls for more democracy and rights for non-Jews in Israel as a call for the destruction of Israel, we should understand it as a call for the transformation of Israel. And rights for non-Jews in Israel. And does that mean Israel cannot be a Jewish state? I guess it depends what you define, but I do think that ethno-nationalism is inherently discriminatory.
Mm-hmm.
And that maybe Israel can be Jewish and democratic if it's not a state.
Mm-hmm. I don't know if I cut you midway, but this does sound like, I was reminded of Benedict Anderson's phrase, imagine community, in terms of having a nationhood, but perhaps not, not necessarily having a state, when you said having still a Jewish identity, but not necessarily being a Jewish state. I think I just want to end it with this last question, if you have the time to respond very quickly, about Jewish voice for peace in the US, and in a sort of, if you can place this in a wider context of the Jewish community themselves, because it's to be fair, there is a very long history of brutalization of Jews of Jewish people in Europe. I mean, starting from the 12th century in England, wholesale massacre, 13th century in France, 15th century in Iberian Peninsula, and it just goes on. And then with the sort of collapse of the absolutist state, republican states in Western Europe in 19th century, leading up to 20th century, but also in Russia, in Eastern Europe, and so on. So there is this, and then finally the Holocaust. So there is this sort of a sense of fear and sense of insecurity within the Jewish community, uh, I'm not necessarily talking about the Israelis because they have been very, I mean, the people whom I know, even on the left from Israel, have been very, very disappointing over the last few months when I have been talking to them. But I have found, on the other hand, in the US Jewish community, good faith people who wants to see an end of this brutalization of the Palestinians, and yet they feel that the need for a sense of security for the Jewish people for the long history. So, can you tell us a little bit about what uh, Jewish Voice for Peace advocates for, and place this in the larger context of what the sense within the community is?
Um, well, I'm not sure I'm completely on board with you about the Israeli left, because I do think that there are, I guess I would say there's the liberal side and then the more leftist side, but that there clearly are still Israeli leftist and human rights organizations like B'Tselem that that are very clear and that did not say, oh, well, now everything's different after October 7th. We don't advocate Palestinian rights anymore. Yet that has happened in some sectors of what you might call the left, but I don't think it's happened to the entire Israeli left, Jewish Israeli left.
Yeah, I mean, I had my comrades who used to say before this event that what Hamas does is basically the result of occupation and colonization. And now what they are saying is Hamas is more like the ISIS, which is like a ludicrous, statement to make. And obviously, my sample space is partly anecdotal, but also partly what I see in the press, in the media. So yes, I mean, human rights, those who are invested in human rights, like B'Tselem and or individuals like Ilan Pape and others who have been very committed with the project. But there seems to be a shift of within the Israeli left, and I hope I am wrong.
Well, I mean, if you look at the editorial page of Haaretz on October 8th, it said, what happened in October 7th is the fault of one person, Benjamin Netanyahu, and not because of intelligence failures, which Haaretz has also looked into, but because of his policies of occupation, of settlement, of repression, of so. Anyway, I don't want to argue about the Israeli left, but I think the Jewish Voice for Peace, and also If Not Now, are two organizations in the United States that have really risen to visibility and prominence since October 7th, that are very clearly self-identified Jewish organizations that are also anti-Zionist organizations. And I think that is kind of the kind of new in the US, because like organizations like the one I was involved in, Caveat, in Berkeley, we were not a Jewish organization. I happened to be Jewish, but I wasn't involved in Caveat as a Jew or because I was Jewish. It was a political organization. And like, to me, my political activism has many, many different sources, but it's not as a Jew any more than it is as a person from Massachusetts. Like, yeah, I'm from Massachusetts. I definitely am. I don't deny it. I'm not ashamed of it or proud of it. It just is. I was born in Massachusetts and I'm Jewish, but that's not my politics. Neither of those is my politics. I'm also the oldest of 3 children. I love that. I don't deny it. I'm not ashamed of it, but it's not my politics. But Jewish Voice for Peace, and If Not Now, being Jewish is part of their politics. And being anti-Zionist is part of their politics. And there have always been Jews from the right as well as from the left who have opposed the state project of Israel. But I think that the prominence of these organizations in a leftist anti-Zionism coming from the Jewish community has been really striking and is a really big part of what's happening in the US now, although it's not all that is. Palestinian voices are also much more accessible and heard in the United States as well.
Hi, my name is Ayushman. I, along with Jyotisman, have started this platform. In the last 2 years, we have tried to build content for the left and progressive forces. We have interviewed economists, historians, political commentators, and activists so far. If you have liked our content so far and want us to build an archive for the left, I have two requests for you. Please do consider donating for the cause. Link is in the description below. Also, if you are not able to do so, don't feel sad. You can always like our videos and share our videos to your comrades. Finally, don't forget to hit the subscribe button.